Good morning. Actually, it's not morning. It's afternoon here. Actually, it's 5 o'clock. So hope you all had a good Monday. And sorry I have not gotten this posted yet, but I'll get it posted here pretty soon. So we are going to start talking about grasslands today. So we'll be talking about adaptations of grasses in particular, which dominate grasslands. And so that's what this lecture will be about. There will be a quiz associated with the lecture, and an assignment or a kind of short activity associated with the lecture as well. So those will be posted on Canvas too. So let's go ahead and jump into the lecture. So here's kind of what we're going to look at in this lecture. We'll talk very briefly about the total amount of grassland cover globally, talk about some characteristics of a grassland. So I'm talking about the structure. We'll talk about the role of precip and compensatory growth. And then we'll talk specifically about 3 grass adaptations. And that'll be it for today. So let's talk about grassland cover globally. So grassland ecologists kind of have, I feel like they kind of have a complex, like an inferiority complex with forest ecologists. So at every kind of national meeting you go to where there might be forest ecologists and grassland ecologists, you can always tell the grassland ecologists because they start their presentation by telling you how much of the world is covered by grasslands, just as a reminder how important they are. So I'm going to do that same thing. But the stat that most people quote, or that you hear a lot of times, is that grasslands or grass-dominated ecosystems cover roughly 40% of Earth's terrestrial surface. And if you look at this pie chart, I don't see a slice of the pie that says grasslands being 40%. So let me tell you how we get to 40%. Technically, when I say this stat, because I am a grassland ecologist and I also have an inferiority complex, what I do is I say grass-dominated ecosystems cover roughly 40%. And the way we get there is we have temperate grasslands, which are obviously grass-dominated. We actually have savannas, which are 10% of Earth's terrestrial surface, and those are really grass-dominated. The tree cover is relatively low in savannas. And so as grassland ecologists, we kind of like gobble up the savanna ecosystem. So that gets us up to 23%. And then the desert ecosystems cover about 20%. And much of those desert ecosystems are either shrublands or desert grasslands. And so a lot of that proportion of Earth's surface is also dominated by grasses. And so if you lump all of those together, you get roughly 40% of Earth's terrestrial surface is dominated by grasses. And then, of course, if you were to throw crops in there, it would be higher because almost all of our crops that feed the human population of the world are grasses. So maize and sorghum and rice, those are kind of big ones globally. Those are all grasses. So anyway, that's my spiel on why grasslands are important and why grasses are important. So let's move on and talk about the structure of a grassland. And this is kind of a no-duh thing, but just to specify, grasslands are dominated by grasses. But there is a decent component of forbs in grasslands, and a lot of times those can add a large component of biodiversity. And they're one of the things that make grasslands really beautiful, especially in the spring, because a lot of them flower fairly early in the spring and have really beautiful wildflowers. And then there's certainly some woody species in a lot of grasslands. That might be some shrubs, that might be some trees, but it's really a small component of the grasslands. And often, especially the tree component, they're confined to the riparian areas and not elsewhere. So one of the things we'll answer here is kind of why grasslands are dominated by grasses. I mean, that's kind of the whole, I guess, topic here is what are the adaptations of grasses that allow them to dominate these regions. So let's talk a little bit just in general about grasslands and where they occur. So this is just a different version of the Whitaker diagram that we've been looking at throughout the semester. So you can see the wide range of precipitation that grasslands and savannas tend to dominate. So Anywhere from 250 to 1500 millimeters of precip is where you might find a grassland or savanna. So they cover a really wide range of areas, and there's lots of areas within this range where forest could occur. So I've drawn these two lines here or the two red lines to bracket this 250 to 1500 millimeter range. And you can see that forests, lots of forests fall well within that 1500 millimeters of precip. Forests tend to start showing up around 1000 millimeters in many areas. Some of these grasslands could support forests, but they don't. And so kind of one of the things in grassland ecology is understanding why that is. And especially as we're seeing changes in precip and temperature, we're seeing encroachment of woody species into grassland. So this question of what makes a grassland has kind of gained renewed interest as recently. So here's just a figure that kind of helps us understand theoretically and conceptually kind of what controls the distribution of grasslands across the world. And so on this figure here, we have three ecosystems listed: grasslands on the far right, savannas in the middle, and then our forests on the left. And these boxes kind of indicate a stable state. So this represents where, a savanna is always going to be a savanna. And then there's these transition zones in between where we have these unstable states. So in this case, the three axes are really important, and we have to kind of interpret them together. So on the left-hand axis, we have precip. On the bottom of this graph, we have fire frequency, but really you could put disturbance frequency in there. Could be grazing, could be, it's really either grazing or fire. And then on the right-hand side, we have rainfall seasonality, and we could relabel this as drought, essentially. So if you have low rainfall seasonality, that means the rainfall is coming, it's fairly uniformly distributed across the year. And then on the high end, which is on the lower side of the right-hand axis, high seasonality means we have like a period of drought during the year. That's essentially what that's indicating. So if we look at this together, places where there's very little disturbance, there's lots of precip, and there's no seasonal drought, so this low seasonality of rainfall, that's where we're going to find our forest ecosystems. But as you start increasing the amount of disturbance, or you're decreasing precip, or you're changing rainfall seasonality, you're going to start entering this transition zone where you might move toward a savanna. And then on the far right-hand side is where we find grasslands. So these are places where there's not as much precip. There's usually some fairly frequent disturbance, whether that's fire or herbivory. And then we typically have a seasonal pattern of rainfall. So that means we've got some drought during the year at some point. And so that's where we tend to find grasses. And so as you move, again, just like in the opposite of forests, if you're in a grassland and something is changing to reduce disturbance or change rainfall seasonality, you might shift from a grassland to a savanna. And that's kind of what we're seeing. Just like when we've talked about forest ecosystems, there's been a lot of fire suppression. That's happened in grasslands too. And so we've shifted from the far right on this x-axis toward the left, reducing fire frequency. And so we're seeing some of these grasslands convert to more like a savanna system. So anyway, this is kind of what controls a grassland system. Grasses then what this tells us, I guess I should say, the fact that grasslands are in this bottom right-hand corner is that grasses can grow in places that don't get a lot of precip and have drought throughout the year and are disturbed very frequently. And so that's kind of what we're going to focus on as far as drought adaptations. I just have a picture here to show some results of a study in Kansas. So this is in eastern Kansas. And this is just showing, if I go back to this figure, this is just showing a transition from kind of a grassland toward a savanna, or really in this case, a shrubland. And so in this study, what they've done is they've changed the fire frequency. So this picture on the left shows a watershed that's burned every year. And you can see that we don't see any woody vegetation in this area at all. But on the picture on the right, this watershed is burned every 20 years. So we've decreased fire frequency, and indeed it has shifted this system to a woody dominated system. So there's still lots of grasses in here, but we have a lot more shrubs. This stuff in the front is a sumac species, which is a woody shrub, and most of what's in the background is a dogwood species, and then you can see some trees down there as well. Okay, so that's kind of like the three components that control grassland distributions. Within the United States and the central Great Plains in particular, we still have that seasonal drought is important and the fire frequency is important, but what really drives the productivity of grasslands is the amount of precipitation a particular region gets in a year. And so each dot on this figure represents a site where the total production in a year was measured. And then on the x-axis is how much precip fell in that year. And you can see this really strong positive correlation. So in grasslands, if you get a high precip year, you're going to get a high production year. And that doesn't happen in every ecosystem. So forests tend to be a little more flatlined, and desert ecosystems have other issues going on, so they're not necessarily as linear as this. But in grasslands, this is a really strong linear relationship. Okay, so that's talking about the structure and the role of precipitation. Let's talk about compensatory growth a little bit before we talk about specific grass adaptations. So compensatory growth was really discovered and postulated in grasslands. We see this happening in other systems and other growth forms as well, but this is kind of where the idea came from. And so in 1979, you can see this paper down here is where this compensatory growth idea was first formally postulated. And what this shows is that essentially grasslands do better if they're grazed. That's the take-home message of all of this. So let me try to walk you through this graph a little bit. On the x-axis, basically this is basically grazing intensity on the x-axis. So 0 means there was no grazing that took place on this grassland. And on the right, as you move to the right, more and more of the forage in that area was grazed. All right, so you can just think of it as grazing intensity. And then on the y-axis here, we have the change in productivity. So we can think about this as how much does an ecosystem grow relative to a control treatment when it's grazed. And so 0, 0 down here would be a place that is not grazed at all. And so 0 change in productivity means that's the baseline productivity. And so as we move up from 0 on the y-axis, that means the production of that system was greater than a grassland that wasn't grazed. And what you see is that we see a really fast increase in productivity with the presence of grazers. So if you put grazers on the landscape, we actually get greater productivity of the plants growing in that ecosystem. And then, of course, as you increase that pressure of grazing, you are going to result in a decrease in productivity. So you can have too much grazing, of course, but there's a sweet spot essentially where your ecosystem is going to be more productive with grazers on the landscape. Keep in mind, this is generally speaking for grasslands. There are certain grasslands that maybe presence of any grazers would have a negative effect. And this here on this graph, there's kind of this 25% removal is a sweet spot. That's not universal either. Some grasslands can handle more grazing pressure than other grasslands. But conceptually, this idea that grazers on the landscape is good for grasslands is fairly universal. And I just have a few graphs here kind of reinforcing this idea. And so what we're going to look at here is the relative cover of different types of plants in different ecosystems. On the solid symbols, let me go forward. Yeah. The solid symbols are ungrazed, and then the open symbols are grazed ecosystems. And on the x-axis here, we have year, so we're going back to 1994 through 2012. And grazing was initiated in this study in 1994. So if we look at some of these results, so let's see, I've cut out, so if you look at the legend here, A through C is tall annual grasses, which I've cut out. D through F, so these upper three panels, are tall perennial grasses, and then the short grasses are down here. And so what's interesting to see is if you put grazers on the landscape, the tall perennial species don't necessarily change very much. You can see in panel F here that there was a decrease in those tall perennial grasses for a while, but it kind of like stabilized over time. And so whether you had grazing or not, you had the same number or amount of cover of these tall perennial grasses. However, the species that really responded positively to grazing were these short perennial grasses. And so if you put grazers on the landscape, you get more of these species. And so the net effect is that you're going to have greater biodiversity in many grasslands with grazers on the landscape. So grazing can improve productivity. It can increase biodiversity on the landscape. And so take-home message is, if managed appropriately, grazing can be really important in maintaining the health of an ecosystem. But as we've seen historically, grazing is mismanaged a lot, or has been historically, and so it has had negative consequences. Okay, so that's just a little bit about compensatory growth. Let's go ahead and talk about some specific grass adaptations now. But we're going to first talk about disturbance tolerance. So if you remember on the figure, kind of the conceptual figure of where grasslands occur relative to savannas and forests, fire frequency or disturbance frequency was really important. And so let's talk about why grasses are so adept at tolerating disturbances. So there's 3 disturbances that we think of grasslands as being really tolerant of: fire, herbivory, and drought. The first 2 in particular are a result of the fact that grasses have what we call basal meristem. So if you remember, meristem is the part of the plant that's actually actively growing. So that's where the cells are dividing and new growth is actually occurring in the meristem. Most plants, especially forbs, shrubs, trees, that meristem is all at the apex or apical meristem, so at the apex of the plant. So if you think about a tree, the meristem mostly is on the outside of that tree canopy. I'm kind of like imagining a deciduous rounded tree canopy here. So if something happens, if those leaves on the outside of the canopy are damaged, that's going to remove some of that meristem, and that's going to have a real detrimental effect on a plant. But if you look at this kind of cartoon of the grass here, this white dot near the soil surface, that's the meristem. That's where the plants are actively growing. And so if you remove the bulk of this above ground tissue, it doesn't have any effect on that vital tissue, that meristem tissue. The plant can simply regrow from the base and stay alive, keep producing, and it's just fine. And so this ability to lose much of its above ground tissue and still regrow is one of the reasons it's so adept at tolerating these disturbances. So whether it's that above ground tissue is removed from mowing or herbivory or fire, it doesn't really matter. Plants, these grasses are going to respond the same way. Okay, so basal meristem, super important for the disturbance tolerance of grasses. And I should go back here. I put drought in here as a disturbance. We think that the grass's ability to tolerate drought also has something to do with the basal meristem, but we don't know for sure. We're kind of like looking into that right now and trying to investigate the role of this basal meristem in grasses surviving drought. But it seems like that might also play a role in its ability to grow in really dry places that have that seasonal drought. Okay, let's move on to root allocation. So here's just a figure showing the root mass fraction of several different functional groups. This is an experiment that is going on in Minnesota. So on the y-axis, we have root mass fraction. What that is it's the amount of root biomass divided by total plant biomass. So if the higher you are on the y-axis, or the further up you are on the y-axis, that means more of your total biomass is invested into the root system. And then on the x-axis, we have several different treatments here, and let's just ignore those treatments now, and we'll kind of just look at these gray bars. So we have a bunch of different species. That's what all these individual panels are. But if we kind of just look down the columns, these are functional groups. So the far left, we have forbs. Then we have legumes. Those are the species that are nitrogen fixers. And then the right two are different types of grasses. So C3 grasses and C4 grasses. And so those bars, the gray bars on the C3 and C4 grasses, are taller or higher than they are for the forbs and legumes. And that's kind of summarized. I'm going to move my photo here for a second because I feel like I'm blocking this figure or this table. This is the average values of root mass fraction for these different functional groups. And so you can see the grasses are around 75% of their biomass is below ground. Forbs are around 60%, and then legumes are around 40%. So grasses are allocating the majority of their biomass below ground. What that means is that grasses are really good at competing for any resources where they're investing their roots. I guess this is just another figure showing this, but oh, I know why I put this in here. So this slide here is telling us that grasses are investing a lot of their biomass below ground. But the caveat is that most of those roots are in the shallow soil layers. So in this figure here, we have three different species. We've got big sagebrush is this gray one. These black triangles are a juniper species, Utah juniper. And then the square symbols show a grass, a C3 grass that grows in western Colorado, Hesperus stipicomata. And what you see is in the shallowest soil layers, so this is 5 centimeters, is this upper portion here, that the vast majority of roots in that shallow soil layer are from that grass. However, if you just go down to 15 centimeters, you can see that the grasses have about the same amount of biomass as the Utah juniper, still more than the big sagebrush. And then as you move deeper, those amounts of roots of the grass just continually decline. So lots of roots, or lots of the biomass is invested as roots, but those roots are confined to the shallow soils. So what that means is that grasses can outcompete. Let me move my picture again so you can see this whole slide. They can outcompete other functional groups for resources that are in those shallow soil layers. And that shallow soil that isn't always 5 centimeters. It depends on what grassland you're talking about. But in general, grasses kind of own, if you will, the shallow soil layers and the resources therein. Okay, so those are our first two grass adaptations, that disturbance tolerance because of the basal meristem, the large amount of root allocation in the shallow soil layers, which allows plants to outcompete any other plant trying to grow in those shallow soil layers. And I should come back to that for a second and just say, what you see in a lot of grassland systems is there are woody species that will germinate, but a lot of times those seedlings never survive because as the roots are trying to grow through the zone where the grasses dominate, they can't compete and they just die before the roots even get below the grass rooting zone. And so that's kind of how grasses can prevent other species from occupying those spaces. Okay, lastly, now we're going to talk about C4 photosynthesis. So C4 photosynthesis is another way that plants can do photosynthesis and fix carbon. A plant is either, we refer to a plant as a C3 plant or a C4 plant. So a plant that does C4 photosynthesis, it always does C4 photosynthesis. So it's not something a plant can turn on and off. C4 photosynthesis has evolved many times in the plant kingdom. And it is not always in grasses, but the vast majority of species that utilize C4 photosynthesis are grasses. And so that's why we're talking about it now. There are some forbs that are C4 that utilize C4 photosynthesis. There's some shrubs and there's one tree. But for the most part, it's all grasses that, not all, it's mostly grasses that utilize C4 photosynthesis. So that's why I'm talking about it now in the grass adaptation section. Okay, let's go back to this figure that we've looked at, I think, a couple of times in the semester. So it's just this trade-off between photosynthesis and how much carbon a plant can take up on the y-axis, and stomatal conductance and how much water a plant loses. And so in order for a plant to grow really fast, so being up on this y-axis, it also has to use water very fast, being on the far right of this axis. And I said early on that like plants can't cheat this trade-off. It's just like fundamental. Well, now we're going to talk about a plant that can cheat it a little bit, not completely, but a little bit. And those C4 plants can do that. So I guess this is a little bit of a preview, but these are the 3 types of photosynthesis we see in plants. So the vast majority of plants are C3. We're talking about C4 now. There's another type of photosynthesis called CAM, and we'll talk about that in like 2 weeks probably, or maybe next week. All right, so one other way plants can utilize or do photosynthesis. Okay, so we've looked at a slide that looks like this. This is just a picture of Rubisco, which remember is the most abundant enzyme on Earth. And early on in the semester, I told you don't have to remember the full name of Rubisco. You just have to remember Rubisco and what it does. But now you need to remember the full name of Rubisco because it's really important. So Rubisco stands for ribulose bisphosphate, and then the CO stands for carboxylase oxygenase. And those are 2 types of reactions, and they have very different implications for plants. Carboxylation means that Rubisco reacts with the CO2 molecule. And that is, we can think of it fundamentally and most basically as being a good thing for plants. It results in a net gain of carbon and positive growth for a plant. So that's a good thing. But Rubisco can actually also react with oxygen. And when it reacts with oxygen, what happens is it actually uses energy to react with oxygen, but it loses CO2. So carbon is actually lost from the plant when Rubisco reacts with oxygen. And remember, the whole goal of a plant is to get as much carbon as possible so it can grow and reproduce and defend itself. And so in this case, when Rubisco reacts with oxygen, it's actually losing carbon it already worked really hard to get. And so this is a really bad thing for plant and eventually results in reduced growth. So plants want to minimize the amount of oxygenation that happens. When Rubisco reacts with oxygen, we call this photorespiration. So carboxylation is good, photorespiration or oxygenation is bad. So now let's go back and think about where these kind of things are happening within a leaf. This is a picture, a cross-section of a C3 leaf. So this plant is utilizing C3 photosynthesis. On the upper part of this image here, this is our stomate. And so when these 2 little cells are open, we know we have CO2 diffusing into the leaf and we have oxygen diffusing into the leaf. So just air, right? And so we've got, whatever's in air is going to diffuse into this cavity here inside the stomate. If you know the concentration of different molecules in the air, you'll know that less than 1%, much less than 1%, it's 0.03% or 0.04% of air is CO2. And a lot more of our air is oxygen. 20% of our air is oxygen. So when these stomates are open, there's a lot more oxygen in here than there is CO2. These green cells in here, that's where the Rubisco is located in a C3 leaf. So as the air diffuses in, Rubisco has access to that air, and so that means it has access to oxygen molecules and CO2 molecules. Now, Rubisco prefers CO2, so it's going to react with it more, but every once in a while, it's going to react with an oxygen molecule because it's there, and maybe it gets distracted or whatever, and it's reacting with an oxygen, all right? So like somewhere in the ballpark of 20 to 25% of the time, a Rubisco enzyme will react with oxygen, which, as you remember, is a bad thing. So there's a couple things to consider here as far as the type of photosynthesis a plant does. So this is, this is C3 photosynthesis. And so in order for a C3 plant to maximize the carboxylation reactions and minimize oxygen, what a C3 plant wants is to constantly fill this cavity with new CO2 molecules. And the only way to do that is to keep your stomate open. All right. So a C3 plant wants to keep its stomates open so it gets new CO2 all the time. But you know that it's losing water at the same time. So a C3 plant that's doing good photosynthesis is losing lots of water. So if a C3 plant is maximizing carboxylation, it's using high stomatal conductance and a high rate of water loss. There's also an effect of temperature. So oxygenation, or that photorespiration, increases with temperature. So I've talked about this before, that where at really high temperatures, an enzyme is going to change its shape and start to fall apart. Well, the shape of the enzymes is constantly changing as temperature changes. And as it warms up, the shape, by the way, I'm doing this because I'm imagining the shape of Rubisco. It's obviously not shaped like this, but so as it warms up, it's changing shape just a little bit, and it starts reacting more readily with oxygen than it did at colder temperatures. So if you increase temperature, you're also going to increase photorespiration, which is bad for a plant. All right, now let's switch and focus on C4 photosynthesis. So this is a picture or a cross-section of a plant that utilizes C4 photosynthesis. And right away, you'll notice that the green dye in this leaf is distributed very differently. It's not throughout the entire leaf. It's really concentrated in these little circular bundles here. This is a vascular bundle. And this right here is a stomate. So when this stomate is open and air is coming in, sorry, I should back up. All the green stuff here in the vascular bundle, that's Rubisco, or it's really chlorophyll, but it's also where Rubisco is located. And so when this air comes into the stomate, it's not actually very close to the Rubisco. And so in a C4 plant, Rubisco is spatially separated from oxygen. And what that means is that in a C4 plant, it doesn't react with oxygen very much. And so it has a really low rate of photorespiration. And the reason it can be spatially separated from oxygen is that Rubisco is not the first enzyme to react with CO2. The first enzyme is PEP-C, or PEP carboxylase. Notice that this has got only the word carboxylase in it, or carboxylation. And so PEP-C only reacts with CO2. It doesn't react with oxygen. So it reacts with CO2 and then kind of transfers that CO2 into the bundle sheath where the Rubisco is. So we're back to this picture here. CO2 is going to diffuse, CO2 and oxygen is going to diffuse in through the stomate. In the cells here, we have PEP carboxylase that reacts with the CO2 and then hands it off to the Rubisco. So the Rubisco essentially never even sees the oxygen that might, come in through the stomate. The vascular bundle that holds the Rubisco is a special, kind of referred to as a specialized anatomy, which is referred to as Krantz anatomy. But what this does is it allows C4 plants to have lower stomatal conductance. Remember, C3 plants are keeping their stomates wide open to get a new supply of CO2 in. C4 plants don't care about that. They don't need a new supply of CO2. They can work with very little amounts of CO2 in the stomate. And so what that means is they can keep their stomates closed and conserve water. That means they can grow in places that are drier. It also means that they can grow in places that are warmer because they're not going to have as much of the photorespiration going on. Even though their enzymes still change shape as the temperatures get warmer, but since there's no oxygen around the Rubisco, they're not going to experience that photorespiration. So that's how C4 photosynthesis works. But most importantly, that we want to take home kind of the habitat or the conditions that each of these types of photosynthesis are best at, or best at growing in. So C4 plants have a higher water use efficiency, means they can conserve water relative to how much photosynthesis they do. They can also maintain growth under higher temperatures. So then we expect to find C4 plants more commonly in hotter and drier climates. Now, just to give you, let me see what's next. All right. Just to give you a ballpark to think about the effect. So I guess basically what I'm saying is that there is both a precipitation and a temperature component for controlling where C4 plants are growing and where C3 plants might grow. So when it gets cooler and wetter, we're going to have more C3 plants, warmer and drier, more C4 plants. Temperature is a more important factor than precipitation. So just as a rough ballpark, a change of 5 degrees C is about the same as a change of precip of about 600 or 700 millimeters, which is a lot of rain, right? So 5 degrees C is equivalent to about 600 millimeters of rain as far as the effects of C4. So what that means is, let's say you're looking at an ecosystem that has a mean annual temperature of 15 and a precipitation of 500 millimeters. If you were to increase the temperature by 5 degrees, so take it up to 20 degrees C, that's going to, that warmer temperature is probably going to favor a C4 plant, right? But if you also increase the precip by, say, 500 millimeters, that would actually favor a C3 plant because you're adding more precip. However, because you've increased temperature by 5 degrees and precip by only 500 millimeters, you're probably going to find more C4 plants in that second ecosystem. So temperature is more important of a factor than precipitation. Okay, so the trade-off though with C4 photosynthesis is that it actually takes more energy. So if you remember, let's go back to the slide right here. So the first step in a C4 photosynthesis is that Pep-C reacts with CO2. In C3 plants, rubisco is the first enzyme. So you basically what you've done is added a whole extra step to photosynthesis in C4 plants, and that reaction takes energy. So C4 photosynthesis takes greater energy, more energy input. So if you've got a C4 plant and a C3 plant growing in a cool, wet place, the C4 plant is doing a lot of extra steps and using a lot of extra energy to do photosynthesis that it doesn't really need to do because it's not hot, it's not dry, so it has no advantage in that regard. So in that situation, the C3 plant is going to be able to outcompete the C4 plant. Only as you get hotter and drier is the C4 plant going to be able to survive and outcompete the C3 plant. So that's the trade-off. C4 photosynthesis takes more energy. Okay, so those are the 3 major adaptations we're going to talk about. And so remember the ability to tolerate disturbances is due to that basal meristem in grasses. They have lots of roots allocated in the shallow soil layers, so they can kind of outcompete anything else in those shallow soil layers. And then we've got lots of species in the grass family that utilize C4 photosynthesis. Again, it's found in other growth forms, but it's most common in grasses, and that gives, so plants that utilize C4 photosynthesis are going to be better at growing in hotter and drier conditions. So here's just a summary slide of kind of what we talked about. I won't go through it again because I've said it already. So that's the lecture on grass adaptations. Again, there's a quiz associated with this and an activity that's kind of thinking about the distribution of C3 and C4 species. And the reason I have that in there is because most grasslands aren't all C3 or all C4. There's usually a mix of C3 and C4. There are definitely some grasslands that are all C3. There's very few grasslands that are all C4. There's usually some C3 grasses in there. And so that the distribution of C3 and C4 species is a really important component of grassland ecosystems. And so there's an activity to just think through how the distribution of C3 and C4 species is changing across the Central Great Plains of the United States. So make sure to do that as well. And yeah, that's all I've got. We'll see you later.